قراءة في كتاب الدين بوصفه نقدا للكاتب عرفان أحمد. البروفيسور عرفان أحمد أستاذ علم الاجتماع بجامعة ابن خلدون في تركيا، شغل سابقا منصب مدير بحث في معهد ماكس بلانك لدراسة التنوع الديني والإثني في ألمانيا، وعمل في جامعة أستراليا الكاثوليكية. صدرت له مؤلفات بارزة حول التفكير النقدي الإسلامي، الديمقراطية في الهند، وتحولات الحركات الإسلامية. يفند الكتاب احتكار الحداثة الغربية للفكر النقدي، ويؤكد أن الإسلام يمتلك أدواته الذاتية لمساءلة الواقع والسلطة. يبرهن أن النقد في السياق الإسلامي ليس مجرد ترف فلسفي، بل ممارسة حياتية تتغلغل من فضاء المساجد إلى الأسواق. يعيد تعريف الحداثة كمشروع متعدد الأوجه، مستنداً إلى مفاهيم تراثية كالاجتهاد والنصيحة كأنماط نقدية أصيلة.
This conversation is about my book in Arabic. So I just want to say a little bit about my knowledge or lack of knowledge of Arabic. As you know, the book is about Islam and critical thinking. So I went to an Islamic seminary in India when I was a kid, and I did learn Arabic, but as many of you might know, the focus on learning in Indian madrasa is always about memorization. So I still remember as a kid, we were told to memorize these different forms of verb. Gharaba yadrabu, to beat, sama yasma'u, to listen, or zahaba yazhabu, to go. So that is the extent of my knowledge of Arabic. But as a Muslim, of course, you also use a lot of phrases from Quran in our day-to-day interaction and conversation. So, la taqnatu min rahmatillah, or la taqtalu awladakum khashyat al-imlaq. So these are the ways in which I relate to Arabic. Now the book is about Islam and critical thinking, and I want to just say at the outset that it doesn't deal with original sources in Arabic, but it does have a strong grounding about knowledge and critical thinking as it appears in the Muslim world based on non-Arabic sources, mainly English. So the two factors which motivated me to write this book are as follows. And of course, these are not the only factors. There are a combination of factors, but here I will focus only on two. One is purely academic. What I mean by this is that since the time of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, the Muslim world has been grappling with many questions, and one of these questions has been to what extent Islam is compatible with reason. And as you know, in the Western thinking, reason and critique, they go together. So in other words, the question in the last 200 years or so has been, if Islam has been compatible with reason and critique, and in the Western understanding, it is further assumed that only with the arrival of the Enlightenment in the 18th century in the West, okay, and that time, of course, the West is not, secular. It is Christian Europe. So only with the advent of the Enlightenment, there is a sustained employment of reason and critique, okay? And this reason and critique is something also which is unique to the West / Christianity. But when they use Christianity, they do not mean Catholicism. It is mostly the Protestant version. So the idea is that critique and reason, these two intellectual properties are something which are unique to the Western Enlightenment. And therefore, the question is asked to what extent Islam is compatible with critique or reason. This question is not necessarily limited to Islam. This question has been raised in relation to Hinduism and other religions too. So this was the academic thing, and I really wanted to explore if this assumption is true, but more importantly, why this assumption has been made in the first place. So rather than simply respond to the question that Islam and critique or reason are not compatible, we also need to ask why such a formulation has been enunciated in the first place. Okay? So this was an academic question, and I wanted to write a book which addresses this question. So that is one factor. The second factor, and I think this is true for most academic exercises, that in many ways the questions that we pursue as a professor or as an academic, these questions also have some biographical element. So before I moved to Amsterdam to do my PhD, so this is the time of late 80s and early 90s. And that time, the main question in India, but also globally, mostly in Britain, but later on also in different parts of the Muslim world, the Rushdie affair, that was a major turning point, and this episode or this controversy was used both by the Indian secular liberal intellectuals as well as the Western ones to say that how Muslims do not have the critical capacity to respond to something like the satanic verses. But this is one incident. You also have later on in early 90s, pseudo-intellectuals like Taslima Nasreen from Bangladesh. She would attack Islam and the Indian media would hail her. Parts of Western media did the same, that wow, she's a critical intellectual and Muslims do not know how to respond to the question that she is raising. So these were some of the events in my life when I was growing up, when I went to college and later on in the university. Now, I moved to do my PhD in Amsterdam in 2001. The same year, you have 9/11 and the so-called global war on terror is launched. And the same question, this reason critique thing is rehashed and presented in a different way. And if you remember, Salman Rushdie, after 9/11, he issued a call for the reformation of Islam, implying that Muslims must undergo the same process of reformation that the Christian Europe had gone. Why? Because it needs to have, it needs to embrace reason and critique, So these were the two, I would say, fundamental factors which motivated me to write this book and really examine this very well-entrenched, well-pervasive assumptions, Now, as as for your second question, which is to say that what the book does in terms of its content and different parts. So the book is, the title of the book in Arabic is الدين بوصفه نقدا, so religion as critique. So my examination of this question led me to argue that this assumption is misleading from the very beginning, and therefore I described my argument or proposition or contention in the book as religion as critique. So it dissolves the pervasive assumption that religion, in this case Islam, and critique, they are two polar opposites. So this is the main reason for the title of the book. The book is divided into two parts. The first part is called illustration. The first part is called formulation, and the second part is called illustration. The first part has 3 chapters, and the second part called illustration, and I think in Arabic it would be tawzi, it has 4 chapters. Now, for the kind of book that I was writing, it occurred to me that I cannot simply take the Western Enlightenment, modernity categories as given and simply apply it to the Muslim history or Muslim culture. Okay? So the task of the part 1, namely formulation, it means that I have to make my own theoretical framework to examine this question, because it was increasingly very clear to me that if I simply adopt the prevalent framework, then I will not be in a position to actually make an alternative argument. So what I did in part 1, which is formulation with 3 chapters, the introduction is, of course, it introduces the topic and gives an outline of the chapters to come. 2 fundamental chapters in part 1 called formulation. The second chapter is called critique, Western and / or Islamic. And what I wanted to argue here is that unlike the dominant assumption about the Enlightenment, in which critique and reason are taken as exclusive property of the West or Europe / Christianity, and it is furthermore assumed that these are not something which are particular, but they are something which are universal. And therefore my argument is that actually Enlightenment is an ethnic project. Okay? Once you have a formulation like this, that Enlightenment, far from being universal, it is an ethnic project, then it follows that to assume that every culture, every tradition, every social formation should become like the Enlightenment or the European society is faulty to begin with. Okay? But some of the viewers might be interested to know that what I mean by Enlightenment as ethnic project. By ethnic project, I'm trained in anthropology and sociology. So the meaning of ethnicity or ethnic boundary in anthropology is that ethnicity comes to play when there is a process of making a boundary or differentiation between the self and the other. Okay? And my point about Enlightenment as an ethnic project was precisely along these lines, that whether it is Immanuel Kant, and Immanuel Kant is a major philosopher not simply in Germany, but in the entire history of Western philosophy, to such an extent that the Western philosophy is divided into two phases, pre-Kantian and post-Kantian. And as you know, Immanuel Kant is considered as the figure of enlightenment. So this is the German version, but also if you go to the French version, where Voltaire is a major figure. So my point is that what is considered as enlightenment, which is supposed to be an articulation of reason and critique, it is ethnic in the sense that both for people or philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Voltaire, Islam was a constant other in relation to which they formulated their own idea of reason and critique. So in the case of Immanuel Kant, I was interested to know what is actually for him the opposite of reason. And the opposite of reason for him is not one, it is many. Sometimes it is superstition, sometimes it is fanaticism, sometimes it is psychological defects, instability in thinking and so on and so forth. And all these negative elements or something which is the opposite of reason, for Kant, Prophet Muhammad becomes the figure to embody or represent these negative characteristics associated with unreason. Okay? So my point is, the Kantian conception of reason itself is pitted against Islam. I mean, Kant, of course, he did not write explicitly about Islam. These are some footnotes, some small passages here and there. But what is critical is that Islam, and sometimes he uses the word Turks, which, also stands for Muslims in general. So my point was, this whole Enlightenment project, far from being universal, it is an ethnic project in one of these very meanings that I've tried to explain. Okay? So this is what I do in chapter 2, in part 1. Chapter 3, it presents an alternative view of Islam, and therefore it is called another genealogy of critique. So in the Western Enlightenment, the history of critique is generally as follows, that, ancient Greece was the citadel or the place where reason and critique began, but, it lay dormant for centuries, and then you have Renaissance, and then you have Reformation, and then you have the Enlightenment. Okay? So this is the Western narrative of reason and critique. I presented an alternative view of, or alternative genealogy of critique, in which, unlike the Enlightenment, where church is opposed to, or church is analyzed as opposite of reason, my point was that there is an alternative genealogy of critique, which is as follows. In Islamic history, the faith and reason, they are not pitted against each other. In fact, I argue that actually, unlike the Western Christian understanding of reason, I say that actually if we view it from an Islamic perspective, God himself is the source of critique and reason. And I explain it in this way, that Allah sent his prophet, over a period of time in different societies and locations. And of course, you have many prophets. Musa alayhi salam was one. Isa alayhi salam is another. And then finally we have the Prophet Muhammad. So I take the Quranic mission, because in Quran, the task of all these prophets, the word that Quran uses is Islah. So if the task of all the prophets, including the final one, Prophet Muhammad, is to do Islah. Now, the task of Islah actually entails the task of critique. And all these prophets, okay, in their respective time and locations, they were critics of the social order in which they lived. So, seen from this perspective, the idea of critique, and by the way, let me say this here, that in Arabic for critique, the word is naqd. In Farsi, you use the word intaqad, and in Urdu, you use the word tanqid. In Turkish also, tanqid is used, okay? So the project or mission of critique is embedded in the history of Islam right from the beginning, and Quran itself is also a book which does a work of critique, okay? It is a critique of the Meccan social order steeped in shirk and jahiliyyah, okay? So through the act of reform, actually the Prophet Muhammad enacts critique, and many Orientalists who uphold the view that reason and Islam are antithetical, sometimes they mobilize this very spurious kind of logic that there is no word in the Quran as a noun for aql. Okay, this is true. What it misses that for Quran the question is not whether aql exists or not, because the Quran uses the verbal form of aql, taqilun. So it already assumes the existence of reason, if you want to use that word to translate aql. The main question for Quran is how to use it, for what purpose, and how it can be deployed in a way that it can yield benefits to humanity. So this is the alternative genealogy of critique, which simply shifts the origin of reason and critique from Greece to the point in which these monotheistic religions came into being, and to the task of the prophets or Anbiya itself. To the task of Anbiya and prophets themselves. By the way, in the book, I also say that, look, from my perspective, Buddha is also a critic of his own time, because Buddha or Gautam Buddha, he mounted a very convincing and total critique of the social order of his time, and especially of the then prevalent Brahmanism and caste system. So this is what I do in part one, which is formulation, a critique of the Western idea of reason and critique, and then I present an alternative account of naqd or reason in Islamic tradition. Okay, now part two is basically devoted to illustrate it. I think in Arabic translation the word used is tawdih. Now before I move to this, let me say this, that the key point of the book's argument is placed early on by using a couplet of the poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal. I used it in Urdu, but in translation it goes something like this. كل قلب ظل للعقل فقط قال ربي أزلا لا تقبلا. So this is from Muhammad Iqbal, and what this couplet, or the ways in which I have used it, its key purpose is to dissolve the very dualism which is at the heart of Western Enlightenment thinking, namely between reason and faith. But here I also want to say that in Islamic tradition, reason and emotion, okay, or reason or faith, rather than being two polar opposites, actually it coexists. So for example, in Islamic tradition, you find that the locus of aql, okay, I mean, you know, in Islamic tradition you do have something called qalb and dimagh. So if you take dimagh as something about thinking, reasoning, and qalb as something in English as heart, but in Islamic tradition, actually dimagh or brain is not something entirely independent. Its locus is also connected to qalb or heart. Okay, so this is what I want to what I wanted to say through this couplet of Muhammad Iqbal. Back to the actual content of the book. So the part 2, which is Tawzif, it has 4 chapters. Now, the first chapter in this illustration part, it basically focuses on Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi, who was the founder of Jamaat Islami in colonial India, and then India was partitioned in 1947, Pakistan is created, and that is where Maududi moves. But I'm more interested in his intellectual and conceptual program. So, in his various writings, okay, Maududi, and we are talking about 20th century or mid-20th century. So I take, and as you know, as a Bani or founder of Jamaat Islami, he also wrote the tafsir of Quran, which is multi-volume, and it has been translated into so many languages, including Arabic. So as an important thinker of mid-20th century, I take Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi as a critical thinker, because if we see his various writings and you put them together, it constitutes something like a corpus, and a critical impulse informs his entire writing. Okay, and of course, many Westerners or some Muslims too, they simplify him and they simply say that, well, there is no complexity in his thought, and equate Maududi with just the slogan of Islamic State. Okay, this is not an academic and sober way of understanding somebody's thought. So I take his writings and his thoughts, many of the concepts that he gave, as a moment of critical thinking in 20th century. Of course, Maududi doesn't start from nowhere. Of course, he's building on the thinking which precedes his time. Okay, so Maududi's writings and his tafsir of the Quran and his activism, I take it as a critical enterprise. Now, the next chapter, next two chapters actually, it deals, based on ethnographic research, how Muslims subjected Maududi's thought and his intellectual project to a thorough critique. So in chapter 5, it is all about Maududi's idea of the Islamic State. And there I talk about how thinkers, both contemporary as well as those who came after Maududi, how they were engaged in a critical dialogue with Maududi, critiquing him on various points, whether a state, the Dawla, is it indispensable, is it dispensable, is it desirable, is it revisable, So there is much happening there, It is not a static thing. It is a dynamic thing, much debated, sometimes with a lot of passion and so on. Here I also talk about the new stream of thinking which I encountered during my field work about Maqasid al-Sharia. The next chapter is called Women and Inequality. And this chapter shows rich, diverse, critical perspective on the question of women, okay? Because Maududi's position on women, in some ways, some people might say that it was very harsh or conservative. What I want to show in this chapter, that how Muslims themselves, both men and women, they continuously debate, they use reason, critique each other's position, and therefore a critical thinking as a practice, not simply as an idea. It exists in our intellectual culture. Now, the final chapter, it focuses on naqd or tanqid or intiqad in our everyday life. And this is a major intervention of this book, because if you look for naqd in Arabic, in Farsi, or in Urdu, most writings will take you straight away to literature, al-adab. So naqd and tanqid in most exposition, they straight away go to literary criticism. In other words, critique becomes equated with textual criticism. This is very interesting. It was only 15 years ago that Oxford English Dictionary included non-text also as a domain of critique. As an anthropologist and sociologist, I was interested also in our everyday life. Okay, and by the way, throughout the book, whenever I use the word everyday life or simply life from an Islamic perspective, and unlike the secular Western perspective, I never talk about simply life. I always say life entwined with death. Okay? So my point was that critique should not be simply confined to the literary domains. In Arabic, in Farsi, and in Urdu, much of the writings on naqd, actually it also relates to poetry, okay? But poetry as divan or something in writing. And I was interested in that, if critique, the way I have explained through alternative genealogy, if it is central to Islam, it will be also manifest, not simply in text, but in our day-to-day practices. So the final chapter, Critique as Social Cultural Practice, it actually takes a social movement as an exemplification of critique. And to this purpose, I focus on a social political movement which was started by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. So this movement is before World War II and after World War I. So during this period, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was not an alim in the technical sense of the term, of course he was educated, and he launched this movement which is called Khudai Khidmatgar. Literally translated, it would be God's servant. Now, this movement started in what is now Pakistan, and under the British rule, that time it was called Northwest Frontier Province. Now the name has been changed. Now it is called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So in that part of the world where literacy was, less than 5%, it is a tribal social formation, and he launched this movement with, and many do not know that this was a spectacular movement in favor of peace. Okay, it was built on the idea of non-violence. So Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, although he was not an alim in the technical sense, but when you see this movement, thousands of people, and not simply in that part of what is now Pakistan, but its impact was, of course, not in the same way, but its impact was also outside of that province. Men, women, literate, illiterate people, people from different professions, they came to appreciate and join that movement. So how was it possible for this movement to come up? And Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, his inspiration was that when he went for Hajj, he got this inspiration to initiate that movement. He used Quran, he went to masajid, he used masajid as a space for this kind of mass movement. He was against the tribal practices which were not in line with the Islamic teachings. He also encouraged women's education. So think of the time in which he lived. So here I want to say that how a social movement can also be seen as critique. I also use what mathil, proverb. Every society has proverb. So the way in which you use the proverb, that can also be seen as an example of critique or not. Finally, to the question that who I have written this book for, so my aim is, of course, to reach a wider audience. So my primary audience is definitely the academics or the intellectuals, students in higher studies at advanced levels, masters and PhD. So that is one set of audience. But I've also, especially as I explained to you in the last chapter, Critique as Social Cultural Practice, since I'm also interested in everyday life, so I also want to reach, and this book is also meant for those readers who are not specialists or who are not academics, general readers. My larger point, and that is where I will conclude, is that by reading this book, I basically do not want to be simply read, which is, of course, nice in many ways. But if the book and what I have done here, if it can also unleash some new thinking and some practical transformation, not simply in academic world, but also in changing the social world and political world that we inhabit. And to say the least, that the world we inhabit today is not a fair one. So in that sense, critique, the way I conceive it, is a tool for empowerment and a tool of social cultural transformation. If by reaching the audience of different kinds, if partially, if I'm able to, through this book, achieve that goal, this would be a great success for me, not simply in material terms, but also in spiritual terms. Thank you very much for having me.